400 planes vanished into the Pacific sky, and only a handful returned. A disappearance so sudden and absolute, it felt as if the ocean itself had reached up and swallowed them. What happened on June 19, 1944, was not merely a clash of pilots or a contest of machines, but a moment when history snapped, when an empire's air arm broke in a single day, and when the balance of the Pacific tilted forever. Before dawn, the sea was still black, a heavy quiet resting across Task Force 58, broken only by the distant growl of engines warming on steel decks. A thin blade of orange light rose behind the horizon, painting the carriers in silhouettes sharp as knives. Men moved in shadows, carrying ammunition belts across slick metal, wiping oil from cowlings, shouting over the roar of Pratt & Whitney engines. Every breath tasted of cordite, hot metal, and salt. Lieutenant Commander David Harrington stepped across the deck of the USS Independence, the wind snapping at his flight suit as he approached the machine waiting for him like a beast, eager to be unleashed. The F6F Hellcat towered above him, metal skin reflecting the first hints of daylight. He rested a hand on the armored cockpit frame, feeling the hum of the 2,000 horsepower engine beneath. 6 50-caliber guns filled its wings, each capable of ripping a fragile Zero apart in a heartbeat. Harrington had flown Wildcats in '42, had fought battles where American fighters clawed for survival, while Japanese Zeros danced around them with terrifying ease. He remembered the helpless feeling of watching friends spiral into the sea, their aircraft outturned, outclimbed, outfought. But this machine, this Hellcat, was born from those defeats, a weapon forged from the harsh mathematics of bitter experience. It was not elegant. It was not delicate. It was built to kill the Zero and survive whatever it took to do it. Beyond the carriers, the Pacific stretched wide and calm, deceptively peaceful, but Harrington knew what waited beyond the horizon. Intelligence reports said the Japanese would come in force, hundreds of planes, perhaps the largest carrier strike they had ever launched. Japan believed they could shatter the American fleet, believed their legendary Zero still ruled the sky. They were wrong, and in a few hours the Pacific would prove it. The myth of invincible Japanese aviation, carved at Pearl Harbor and refined across Wake Island and the Coral Sea, would break. The Hellcat would write its legend in fire, but just 3 years earlier, the story was brutally different. In December 1941, Japanese aircraft swept across Pearl Harbor with a precision America had never seen. The Zero, sleek, fast, impossibly responsive, tore through American defenses. It climbed like a rocket. It turned inside anything America could send against it. Pilots called it a ghost, a phantom that ignored every rule of combat they had been taught. Harrington's first tour in the Pacific had been a lesson in survival. Facing the Zero in a Wildcat meant accepting that every maneuver carried the scent of death. You didn't outturn a Zero. You didn't outclimb it. You hit once, dove away, and prayed the pilot behind you wasn't better. But America adapted. Engineers studied every scrap of intelligence, every bullet hole in every damaged Wildcat, every breathless report from pilots who had stared into the spinning blades of a Zero and lived long enough to talk about it. And then they built the Hellcat, not as a mirror to the Zero, but as its executioner. Self-sealing fuel tanks, armored cockpit, heavy guns, thick wings, a frame that could take punishment and keep flying. It was the opposite of the Zero in every way that mattered. Where the Zero was fragile, the Hellcat was iron. Where the Zero demanded elite pilots, the Hellcat forgave rookies. And by 1944, American industry could feed the skies with Hellcats faster than Japan could train a new generation of aviators. The balance had shifted. In the Marianas, the stakes were nothing less than the future of the Pacific. Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, 3 islands that placed the Japanese homeland within reach of American bombers. Admiral Raymond Spruance and Admiral Mark Mitcher assembled a force the world had never seen. 15 carriers, hundreds of ships, nearly 1,000 aircraft. Opposing them, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa mustered Japan's remaining strength, 9 carriers and a patchwork of aircraft flown by a shrinking cadre of veterans and a growing number of barely trained boys. Many had fewer than 50 hours in the cockpit. Some had never flown from a carrier deck before. Yet they came, driven by hope, by desperation, by a belief that somehow the Zero's legend could still be enough. On the night of June 18th, Harrington walked the deck alone, the wind warm, the sea restless. His Hellcat sat with wings folded like a sleeping predator. He ran his hand across the metal, feeling a certainty settle in his chest. This was not 42. This was not running from death in a wildcat. This was a new war, and at sunrise, the Zero's reign would end. Dawn arrived with a strange electricity, a charge in the air that seemed to hum through every man aboard the carriers. Mechanics shouted across roaring engines. Armorers fed belts of ammunition into waiting wings. Pilots strapped into cockpits slick with morning dew. Captain Walter Green, commander of Air Group 22, addressed his men with a voice carved from combat. "Today is the reckoning," he said, pointing to the tactical map. "They will throw everything at us. You will throw it back." Harrington stood beside his wingman, Lieutenant Samuel Ortiz, a young pilot with a quick grin and nerves forged in fire. "Think they'll hit all at once?" Ortiz asked. Harrington shook his head. "Doesn't matter. Whatever they send, we're ready." Across 15 miles of ocean, the American fleet stretched like a floating city of warships. Battleships guarding the line, carriers poised like giants, destroyers knifing through the waves. Above them, radar screens flickered to life, detecting shapes rising far to the west. Dozens, then hundreds. An entire air arm stretching its wings for what Japan believed would be its decisive strike. Mitcher issued the order. "Fighters up. Hold the line far from the carriers." The first Hellcats hurtled down the deck, flung into the golden morning by the catapults. Harrington felt the violent shove, then the sudden freedom of the sky as the Hellcat climbed effortlessly, pulling him toward the growing light. Ortiz slid into formation beside him, his fighter glinting. Below, the carriers shrank, tiny islands of steel in an ocean beginning to wake with the thunder of war. At 15,000 feet, the first reports came through. Multiple bogies, bearing 270, estimate 80 plus. Harrington adjusted his mask, eyes sharpening. Ahead, the horizon darkened as a swarm of aircraft rose into view. Zeros, Vals, Judys, torpedo bombers fanning out like ink spreading through water. Commander Frank Dalton's voice cut through the static. "Remember your training. Boom and zoom. Never turn with a zero." The American fighters descended like falling stars. Harrington pushed the throttle forward, and the Hellcat roared into its dive. Wind screamed around the canopy. The altimeter needle spun. Below, a zero flashed across his sights. Harrington squeezed the trigger. Tracers streaked into the fragile enemy fuselage. Flames erupted. The aircraft disintegrated in a spray of smoke and metal. "Splash 1," Harrington called, pulling into a climb as Ortiz blasted a Judy into a fiery spiral. The sky exploded into chaos. Hellcats slashed through Japanese formations, ripping them apart before they could organize. Bombers fell in flames. Torpedo planes tumbled end over end. Zeros clawed for angles, but were too slow, too outmatched, too fragile against American guns. Ortiz shouted through the radio, "I've got 2 on me!" Harrington rolled hard, dropped behind them, and stitched the first Zero's engine with bullets. The second broke off. Ortiz climbed free. Everywhere Harrington looked, the sky burned. By 10:30, the first Japanese wave was shattered. Less than a dozen aircraft reached the fleet, and none survived the anti-aircraft fire waiting for them. But radar screens glowed again with new contacts. Larger, denser. A second wave. Harrington and Ortiz climbed with what fuel and ammunition remained. "You ready?" Harrington asked. "Always," Ortiz answered. The sky to the west darkened again. Another mass of aircraft rising like a storm surge. The Hellcats met them head-on. Harrington ripped apart a Val carrying a bomb that detonated mid-air, spraying fire across the clouds. Ortiz downed a Zero with a burst so clean, the enemy simply folded and fell. But danger tightened around them. A Zero slipped behind Harrington and stitched bullets across his wing. He dove, the enemy following too closely. At 5,000 feet, he pulled into a climbing turn the Zero couldn't match. It stalled. Harrington rolled over and finished it with a burst that lit the sky. Wave after wave slammed into the American fighters. Over 100 aircraft in the second attack, then 80 more in the third. The third wave consisted of boys, green pilots barely trained, flying machines they could not master. They died by the dozens, then by the hundreds, their formations dissolving under disciplined American strikes that rotated in seamless cycles, fresh Hellcats replacing those low on fuel. The fourth wave was an act of desperation. Training planes, obsolete fighters, anything that could fly. They were gone almost as soon as they appeared. By mid-afternoon, the sky grew strangely quiet. Only smoke trailed across the horizon. Only debris floated on the waves. Harrington leveled out at 12,000 feet, breathing hard, hands trembling from the hours of combat. "How many do you think we got?" Ortiz asked, voice tired. Harrington looked at the empty sky. "Too many to count." He returned to the Independence, landing on the trembling deck, the fighter jerking to a halt. The smell of burned powder clung to his flight suit. Pilots staggered from their cockpits, laughing, shaking, exhausted. Mechanics swarmed the aircraft like surgeons, touching scars of battle, patching holes. Ortiz jogged over, eyes wide. "Skipper, I've never seen anything like that." Harrington nodded. Neither had anyone. That night, the mess deck buzzed with voices. Stories of dives, kills, close calls filled the air. But beneath the noise lay a heavy truth. Japan had thrown the last of its strength at them, and lost everything. Captain Green addressed his men. "Gentlemen," he said, "today we destroyed Japanese carrier aviation." Silence followed. 400 enemy aircraft down. American losses, 29. Later, Harrington stood alone at the rail, watching fires flicker on the horizon. He thought of those Japanese pilots, many barely men, thrown into a battle they could never win. He felt no triumph, only the sober understanding that war was now a machine, one Japan could no longer feed. America produced 2,000 aircraft a month. Japan produced a fraction. America trained pilots with 300 hours in the cockpit. Japan sent boys with 50. The imbalance was no longer a tilt. It was collapse. By morning, the Pacific was still. No swarms of Zeros. No roars of engines rising from the west. Only waves rolling beneath the carriers as they pushed further toward Japan. On June 19, 1944, Japanese naval aviation did not retreat. It ended. And from that day onward, American carriers sailed wherever they wished, escorted by Hellcats that had rewritten the law of the sky. Months later, those same fighters circled above Tokyo Bay as Japan surrendered aboard the USS Missouri. The Zero's legend was gone. The Hellcat remained, symbol of a turning point, symbol of industrial might fused with courage, symbol of the day the Pacific sky declared its verdict. The age of the Zero was over. The future belonged to the Hellcat. Later that afternoon, the task force shifted course, steaming westward in a long, determined line. The air smelled of hot steel as the sun climbed overhead, baking the flight deck until the metal shimmered. From the observation platform, Harrington watched as the crew prepared for the next phase of operations. Bombing strikes, reconnaissance flights, the relentless grind of naval warfare that never paused, even for monumental victories. He saw Ortiz helping a mechanic replace a damaged panel on his Hellcat's wing. Saw Green speaking quietly with Dalton over tactical maps. Saw the calm precision with which the carriers carved their way through the blue vastness. No one celebrated anymore. They simply worked. Because everyone knew that even though the edge of the Japanese spear had been snapped, the shaft still remained. And it would take more battles. Saipan, Guam, Tinian, Iwo Jima, to break it entirely. That evening, Harrington stood alone on the fantail of the Independence, the sea wind warm against his face. The Pacific stretched beneath him like a mirror of hammered gold as the sun sank, flames of orange and red bleeding across the water. He thought of the boys he had seen falling from the sky, their parachutes opening like broken flowers over the waves. He wondered how many had families waiting, believing still that their sons were invincible warriors of the Empire. He wondered how many had ever wanted this war at all. The Zero had made them gods once. Yesterday it made them martyrs. And the Hellcat, the machine Harrington trusted with his life, had been the silent judge of them all. He closed his eyes, letting the low drone of engines settle into a rhythm beneath his feet. The carriers pushed into the twilight, heading closer to islands that would soon burn, closer to battles where Hellcats would again fill the sky. Ortiz approached quietly, stopping at the rail. "They're calling it something already," he said. Harrington opened his eyes. "Calling what?" Ortiz shrugged. "The battle. The guys on the Princeton said someone joked that it was like shooting turkeys. Then the name spread." Harrington let out a slow breath. Turkey shoot. The phrase felt strange on his tongue, too light, too simple for what had happened. But he knew history had a way of choosing its own language, whether men liked it or not. Night descended fully now, stars unfurling across the sky like silent sentries. The fleet sailed beneath them, a constellation of its own, dots of yellow light burning on the waves, tiny and fragile against the vastness. Harrington looked upward and felt, for the first time in years, that the sky belonged to them. Not to fear, not to myth, not to the ghosts of Pearl Harbor, but to the pilots who had clawed their way back from those early defeats, who had learned, adapted, rebuilt, to the factories that worked day and night, to the instructors who refused to let green recruits die the way others had died before them, to the engineers who believed that steel and oil could be forged into something that might save a nation. Far away, the remnants of Ozawa's fleet limped north. Carriers that once symbolized Japanese power, now stripped of the very thing that made them lethal. Empty decks, silent hangars, ghosts drifting across moonlit waters. No air arm remained to defend them. No pilots to avenge them. A generation of Japan's finest aviators had vanished in a single sunrise. The men who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had roared across the Pacific in the Empire's first blazing months, had either fallen in earlier battles or perished in yesterday's final unwinding of their legend. Harrington rested his arms on the rail and listened to the distant waves. He knew the war wasn't over. Knew there would be more loss, more blood, more nights like this one. But something fundamental had changed. The Pacific had shifted. An empire had cracked. A myth had died. And somewhere deep in the silence of that night, beneath the thrum of engines and the salty wind sweeping the deck, Harrington felt a truth settle inside him like a stone in calm water. No matter what battles lay ahead, the sky would never again belong to the Zero. From this night forward, it belonged to the Hellcat, to the pilots who flew her, to the fleets that sailed beneath her wings, and to the future already beginning to take shape beyond the horizon. A future forged in smoke, steel, and a sky reclaimed.